All right, this time we're going to finish off the 7 trumpets. The Great Alarm, Muslims on the move. Very important topic. It leads us into where we're headed next weekend. This vital subject. I'm going to review the first 4 trumpets because you've forgotten when we even had those about a week ago. And there's some pretty heavy-duty words in the prophecies, and you're going to scratch your head sometimes, like, what on earth is all that about? Let me tell you, the 7 trumpets is probably the most difficult part of the book of Revelation, but I hope we can make it easy for us so that we can get the handle on it. Okay, so let's go. Remember, the 7 trumpets are found in Revelation chapter 8, verses 2, right through to the end of almost of chapter 11. And we'll be in chapter 10 and 11 because they're part of the 7 trumpets. They finish at the end of chapter 11, but there's 2 vital in what we call interludes in the 6th trumpet. 6th trumpet is very important, and we'll just introduce that tonight. Let's begin again. I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and to them were given 7 trumpets. Then another angel, having a golden censer, came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense, that he should offer it with the prayers of all the saints upon the golden altar, which was before the throne. And the smoke of the incense, with the prayers of the saints, ascended before God from the angel's hands. Now we have 2 altars actually, we didn't talk about that. 2 altars are mentioned here. It says he came and stood at the altar. Remember that? He's talking about the altar of burnt offerings at that point. You see, the angel was coming over to the altar, and incense was given to him. Another angel evidently gave him incense, because in the temples, this is the sort of thing what happened. They would come to the altar of burnt offerings, and at the altar of burnt offerings, they would be given incense and even fire to put in their censer. Then they would go to the golden altar. So what happens is this angel, he goes to the altar of burnt offerings where the animals were burnt, and he's given much incense. And then he comes in to the altar of incense called the golden altar. And there he offers the incense with the prayers of God's people. The incense represents the fragrance of Christ. That's why he goes to the altar outside. That's the place of sacrifice. And because of Jesus' death, righteousness is ours. And so the angel sends this fragrance, which really represents the beautiful life of Christ as our friend. Then the angel, after that, so he's taking this incense with the prayers of God's people. Then the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, went out, got the fire, and smashed it on the ground, threw it to the earth. And there were noises, thunderings, lightnings, and an earthquake. Those words, lightnings, thunder, earthquake, always usually represented for judgment. So we see 2 things are mentioned. There's intercession during this time, but there's also judgment during this time. That's why we said these are important. So the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound. Let me just tell you what happened a little more clearly in the temple, and you get an understanding. So the priest, in the evening time, the priest would go, the one who was with the incense, he would take his censer, and he would go to the altar where the animals were sacrificed near there and burnt. Then they would put incense in the censer. He would come back, go to the golden altar before the throne, before the curtain, and he'd offer the incense, because outside all the people of God were praying while he's doing this. So then he'd go up, and then he would come out with his censer, and then he would come out, get fire from the altar again, put it in there, and he'd smash it on the ground. Meaning, intercession is finished for the day. God has heard our prayers, all is well. And that picture is picked up in Revelation. It's quite interesting. So then, after that they would blow the trumpets at the end of that. Now, John is talking about that experience, but he's also talking about the blowing of the trumpets feast, because before the judgment came, Yom Kippur, remember, they blew the trumpets 10 days before. Okay, so let's put this all together. Then the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound. And so he smashed that on the ground just before that. All right, now the 7 trumpets. These are warning judgments in mercy. When you get to the plagues, there's no mercy mixed with those, because the opportunity to accept Christ is finished. It's finished by that time. But with the 7 trumpets, people have got opportunity to change their ways. That's why the incense is there, and the incense goes up with God's people's prayers on behalf of for people and so on. So these are warning judgments through the ages in mercy. 7 warning judgments from the cross down to the coming of Jesus. That's what's going on. There are judgments going on. The censer thrown down means there's judgment in different parts. But at the same time, because there was incense, there's also mercy mixed with it during the trumpets. All right. Now the 7 trumpets actually are an answer to prayer. The prayer is found in the 7 seals and the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Under the 5th seal, this question. When he opened the 5th seal, I saw those who had been slain for the word of God. They cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? When are you going to act, God? And the answer to that is the 7 trumpets tell us God is hearing prayer. Sometimes it almost seems like our prayers don't go any further than the ceiling. But if we're God's people, they are heard, and God will answer. He may not answer as quickly as we want, but he is going to answer when he's ready and for your best. And when it comes to how long, when are you going to do something about our troubles, God says, I'm hearing, and I'm going to act. So these people are crying out, Lord, why? When are you going to do something? And so God says with the 7 trumpets, I hear and I'm answering. Now remember, we're just going to review these quickly. We went through the first 4 trumpets, so just quickly. Trumpet number 1, judgment on Israel. The nation of Israel. Why? Because the nation of Israel crucified Jesus Christ. For 3.5 years he pleaded with them. He cried over the city. He did everything he could. On the cross he prayed, Father, forgive them. And then they persecuted his followers. Classic example is Paul. He was rounding up Jews to kill them, to imprison them. The Jews did that. Jesus gave another 3.5 years after his death and went back to heaven. I can't give these people up, so he pleads with them again, but they don't want anything to do with it. And so finally God says, okay, I have to allow you your choice. I don't want you to do this, but I'm going to have to remove my protective hand. So God has been holding back trouble from them, but now he says, okay, this is what you want, so I have to let go. God doesn't do it, but he removes his protective hand, and the devil then does what he wants to do. So 70 AD, the city of Jerusalem is destroyed. Trumpet number 2, ancient Rome, judgments on ancient Rome, remember. 200 AD to 476 AD. What's going on? Well, who did the Jews use to kill Christ? Of course, the Romans. What did the Romans do after Jesus went back to heaven? They persecuted God's people. They said, just offer a pinch of incense. If you do, you can live. If you don't, you get butchered in the arenas, remember? Now, Rome has been killing God's people, so Rome is going to have to answer to God. God will remove his protective hand. And so what happened? We saw the barbarians end the Western Roman Empire in what was Rome in the West. Tragic. And Rome is sacked in 410 AD by the Visigoths. Then the 3rd angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell on 1/3 of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood, and 1/3 of the waters became wormwood, and many men died from the water because it was made bitter. So there we come to the 3rd trumpet. What was that one? Judgment on the compromising Christianity, remember. Who's the wormwood star that falls from heaven? That's Satan. What's he doing? Satan like a shining light. Jesus said, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. The wormwood star fallen from heaven, that's Satan. What's he doing? He's polluting the Christian people, polluting the church. Why did he do that? Because Constantine, when he came along, he offered the church what? Let's have ourselves a church-state union. And Christianity bought into it, accepted it, and it caused great trouble for the church. Church-state union in Rome, but a church-state union in Byzantium. Remember, the Emperor Constantine moved his seat to what we call Istanbul today. He moved it there because he could see trouble coming up from those barbaric tribes, so he went there, and they formed a church-state union over there with the church as well. Both places. Byzantium, or Constantinople, was the Roman capital. The church-state union in Byzantium, what we would call Orthodox Christianity today, that's where it began from. Church-compromised Bible truth we saw. Because of the church-state union, some of the world more and more slipped into the church. They compromised the Bible truth. Pagan beliefs flooded into the church. Rome became Christian. The church fell away from truth. That's what God is saying. Listen, if you embrace this is what's going to happen. I'm going to have to withdraw my protective hand, and this is what's going to happen. And you can see the church fell from truth. 150 AD, the Sabbath gets changed to Sunday. That's going to harm people because you forget about what the Sabbath points to. 381, intercession and worship of Mary begins in the Christian church. Tragic, we saw. 416 AD, infant baptism comes into the Christian church. 783 AD, the worship of images and saints comes into the Christian church. You can see what's happening. Now this is what's taking place in the church. Okay, trumpet number 4. This is where we ended, and we'll move on. Judgment on apostate Christianity now. The church has compromised. False teachings have come in. Now it's going to seep down and affect it even more. What happens? Lights going out. Remember, the third of the sun, the third of the stars, the third of the moon all go out, we saw. In other words, deepening apostasy in the Western church in Rome, deepening apostasy in the Eastern church in Constantinople. All of Christianity is getting affected. What's going on? Tragic. Cardinals, priests, and bishops have sexual relationships with women. Hang on, we're supposed to be celibate. Well, didn't come in until later on, but they're supposed to not be doing that, that's for sure, right? They're not married. Popes, bishops have illegitimate children. We know that from history. You can see what's happening. When you mess around with truth, when you mix the things of the world, pretty soon you do stuff that you would never normally have done. So the church falls further from truth. 1100s AD, baptism by immersion ceases. 1123 AD, celibacy of the priests. Strange, when Peter was allowed to take his wife, the Bible says, he had a wife. But now, 1123, celibacy of the priests. And we see the harmful effects of that today, let me tell you. When priests can't marry, this is why we have all this problem all around the world. 1215 AD, confession to the priests comes into the church. Now people are confessing to human beings. Tragic, this one. This is what corrupts people. You see, if you're the priest and you've got to listen to everybody's terrible sins, that's going to corrupt you. Listening to all their moral falls. Not only that, the confessional was actually used by the church to get secrets from people, and they could actually use this to bribe people, and they did. It went on. I mean, you imagine, I go here to Brendan, I confess, says the priest, and I confess all my woes to Brendan, tell him about how I've been sleeping with other women. He's got the opportunity to say to me, hey, I'm going to tell your wife unless you hand over a few. That's went on, that sort of thing, of course. That's why it became a terrible thing for Christianity in the world. 1229 AD, the Bible reading is forbidden. You can see the slide. That's what God was saying. I'm going to have to open the floodgates. This is what you want. You don't want truth? Well, this is where it ends. There were calls for reform back to the Bible. Godly priests, godly bishops wanted the church to come back to Scripture, but their voices were silenced and many were burnt. Both in the West and in the East, executions took place aplenty. God wasn't going to let that go, and so now the fifth trumpet. We're on the fourth, aren't we? Dark Ages, a bloodbath for the church. We saw that. Crusades, Christians killing Muslims. 100 years war between divergent groups there. England and France, religious wars and so on, Black Death. Why? Because people weren't reading the Bible, so they didn't know about how to look after your body as the temple of God. It's all in the Bible, we saw. All right, the Inquisitions. So now God blows, his angels blow trumpet number 5 to deal with the church because of all that stuff that's been going on. It's quite a trumpet blast. So watch what happens, and then we'll just summarize it. Then the 5th angel sounded, and I saw a star fallen from heaven. Here we go again. Satan is going to come down and mess things up. He came to the earth. To him was given the key to the bottomless pit. So God steps back, lets Satan do his thing, in other words. He was given the key to the bottomless pit, and he opened the bottomless pit, and smoke arose out of the pit, like the smoke of a great furnace. So the sun and the air were darkened because of the smoke. But what was the smoke? It looked like smoke, but what was it? Then out of the smoke, locusts came. It's a cloud of locusts that looked like smoke. Locusts came upon the earth, and to them was given power, as the scorpions of the earth have power. They were commanded not to harm the grass of the earth, or any green tree, any green thing, or any tree. You know what locusts are like? Eat everything. But only those men who did not have the seal of God on their foreheads. And they were not given authority to kill them, just to give them a hard time, but to torment them for 5 months. Their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it strikes a man. In those days men will seek death and will not find it. They will desire to die, and death will flee from them. What's going on here? We'll talk about it in a minute. The shape of the locust was like horses prepared for battle. On their heads were crowns of something like gold, and their faces were like the faces of men. They had hair like women's hair, and their teeth were like lions' teeth. These are ferocious monsters, aren't they? And they had breastplates like breastplates of iron. Man, you can't do these fellows in. They're really protected well. And the sound of the wings was like the sound of chariots, like many horses running into battle. They had tails like scorpions, and there were stings in their tails. Their power was to hurt men 5 months. And they had as a king over them the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, but in Greek he has the name Apollyon. One woe is past, one trumpet, that's number 5. Behold, still 2 more are coming after these things. Now you're wondering, what on earth was all that about? I told you would wonder, wouldn't you? Now I want you to think. Obviously this is impressionistic language, right? They're not locusts don't look like horses and so on, but they act like an army, because locusts go everywhere. But this one, they don't usually have a king over them, but this one does. This army has. And what's it talking about? Well, this is judgment on the persecuting church through Islam now. We're going from 700 to 1449, thereabouts, okay? Because they've been persecuting, lots of stuff's coming into the church. God says, that has to be dealt with. My people are praying. I hear their prayers. Then the 5th angel sounded, and I saw that star fallen from heaven. Just going to see this a little bit. To the earth. To him was given the key to the bottomless pit. In other words, God is removing his protection now. And this angel in the bottomless pit, this is the devil, he is given the key. He's allowed to do what he wants to do because God is removing his protective hand. But not everybody's going to be destroyed, because only portions. And they had as king over them the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, which means destruction. But in Greek he has the name Apollyon, which means destroyer. This is the devil. He's the star, again, fallen from heaven, that's already come down. And this time, he's going to cause destruction on people. That's what it's saying. All right. Now he opened the bottomless pit, the wastelands of the earth. Remember, the earth was without form and void. After the 1,000 years, during the 1,000 years, the earth is like a bottomless pit we saw. It's the earth in chaos. In other words, from the wastelands of the earth, smoke arose out of the pit like a smoke of great furnace. So the sun was darkened, and the sun and the air were darkened because of the smoke of the pit. Then out of the smoke the locusts came upon the earth, and to them was given power, as the scorpions of the earth have power. Now we're going to give a quick, very brief 101 on Islam for a moment. Not too much, but just enough to get it. Now, Islam began in the wastelands of Saudi Arabia. It's where it came from. This is like the bottomless pit, in other words. It's a wasteland. Now, Islam, of course, started with Muhammad. He began in Medina. Muhammad, of course, then eventually moved to Mecca. But Muhammad, for the first 100 years, he tried to change people through peaceful means. But it didn't work, really. He hardly had any converts after the first 100 years thereabouts. Most people in Saudi Arabia were polytheists, worshipped many gods. And of course, Muhammad obviously got his material from both the Jews and the Christians, because a lot of things in the Quran and so on clearly have Christian flavors and Jewish things in them, as well as others, of course. But he tries to convert. When that fails, Muhammad turns to, basically would say, warfare. Now I want you to notice, interesting, that the range of the desert locust, this was the range of the desert locust in the Middle East and North Africa. This is the range where the Islam spread, very similar areas, because not go down in the desert too much in here for people, but this is the range. It's interesting just to contrast these two. The shape of the locust was like horses prepared for battle, and the sound of the wings was like the sound of chariots with many horses running into battle. Very good picture of the way Islam spread quickly. The spread of Islam by, first of all, the Arabian Muslims, we would say, took place over about 3 or 4 centuries. From around 600 AD, they spread out very quickly across the Middle Eastern world. And many people became Muslims. They even went to Spain, invaded Spain, and it looked like they were going to get into France, but of course the Battle of Tours stopped them from going any further, and eventually they went back. The Saracens came to an end. Now, the Saracens repeatedly attacked Constantinople, the center of Christianity in the east, where the Roman emperors were ruling from. They continually, but they were never successful in taking Constantinople. It was too strong for them. They couldn't take it. Now, what does it mean, this? They had tails like scorpions, and there were stings in their tails. Their power was to hurt men for 5 months. Well, in the Bible, you'll recall, we saw this earlier, the tail stands for deception. Isaiah, the elder and honourable, he is the head. The prophet who teaches lies, he is the tail, the deceptive prophet. Now, we need to say something. The false teachings of Islam drove Muslims on their conquest. There's no question about that. Before this time, there were many tribes of Arabs, but Muhammad united them all. And the reason they went to war was for some very obvious reasons. When we go to the Quran, just a couple of quick teachings which drove them. These are false teachings, but they did drive things, like the tail. Holy war is very clearly taught in the Quran. Now, there are all sorts of what we would call people trying to say, yeah, it was just holy war sort of spiritually. No, it was holy war physically as well, no question about it. But notice what it says in the Quran. Allah loves those who fight for his cause. He will lodge you in pleasant mansions in the gardens of Eden. That is the supreme triumph. Now, if you knew you were going to get something out of going to war, not only in this life, because they could have the people's stuff, you would probably think that wouldn't be a bad idea to go to war. Here's another one. Those involved in jihad or holy war, they receive greater pleasures in heaven than those who don't. Notice what it says in the Quran. Allah has promised all a good reward, but far richer is the recompense of those who fight for him, meaning holy war. Now you can see this was one of the factors that drove people, Arabs, to go everywhere, because there were some good rewards coming at the end of it all. This helped drive it. Now we have to be fair on Islam, however. We don't want to be one-eyed. They were not as vicious as they are today, to say some people. back then. Let's talk about it in a moment. They were commanded not to harm the grass of the earth or any green thing or any tree, but only those men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. Okay? Now we saw last time that the green trees and the green grass represent God's people. Jesus said on the way to the cross to those ladies who were crying, if they do this thing to a green tree, meaning himself, what will happen to the dry tree? Going to be completely destroyed. So he likened that. And other parts in the Bible, we say, like a tree in the Psalms planted by the waters. This represents God's people. So don't harm God's people here. Now, the people of the book are what the Muslims call Jews and Christians. They have a respect for the prophets and so on, have a respect for Jesus. So these people were not really mostly not worried. The Muslims did not destroy them. They allowed them to continue. Now, it's true that Christians and Jews had to pay more tax, and some other things happened, but generally speaking, the Muslims in this period did not just wipe out Christians indiscriminately. That's for sure. They didn't do that. They allowed them, even though they were sort of like second-class citizens, but they didn't wipe them out at all in most cases. Now, remember the Sabbath, the seal of God. God's seventh-day Sabbath is the outward sign of God's seal. We just read in the text that they were not to harm those who had the seal. And it's interesting that when the Arabs came to Armenia and so on, the Armenian Sabbath keepers were allowed to keep going. They were not allowed to convert people to Christianity, certainly not Muslims, but they were allowed. Same in Ethiopia, because that's where the Arabs went to. The Sabbath keepers of Ethiopia, they were able to survive because God had said, you can do so far, Satan, but no further, and so it was. They were not given authority to kill them, but to torment them for 5 months. They had tails like scorpions, and there were stings in their tails. Their power was to hurt men 5 months. Okay, so what's that talking about? Well, we're dealing with a prophecy here, right? 5 months. 5 months for tormenting attacks, but not destroying the church in the east, in other words. You can attack it, but you're not going to wipe it out. Biblical months had 30 days. So 5 months would be 5 times 30, right? 150 days. Now, in Bible prophecy, we've seen one prophetic day, one literal year. Thank you, Mr. Ezekiel. We've seen that many times, all right? In Bible prophecy. So in other words, 150 days, 150 years. It is very interesting that this man, Osman I, comes to power on July 27, 1299. This begins the Ottoman Empire, it's called, all right, from this time onwards. Now, this time period, 150 years, is going to take us to July 27. What is it going to be? 1449. Now, something interesting happens. The Ottoman Turks take Anatolia from the Byzantines. Now, what do we mean, the Byzantines? That's the Christians in the east. They're called the Byzantine Empire. The Caesars and the church together in bed, and all the Christians going along with it. So the Turks now, the Ottoman Turks, they sweep into what we call most of Turkey, and they take over, but they can't get Constantinople. It's too strong for them. Ottoman Turks attack Constantinople a number of times, but they fail. They can't get it. In other words, Byzantine Christianity is getting pretty hurt, but it's not dead. It's going to come, we'll see next. Constantine XI is an interesting guy. This guy's crowned by the Byzantine emperor in 1449. But in order to be crowned king, he has to go to this guy here, Sultan Murad II, and say, can I become the king of the Byzantine Empire? Now, if you have to go and ask someone else, can you become the king, who's really in charge here? Very obvious. The Sultan is in charge. He can't get Constantinople. He hasn't got that yet. But as far as everything else, this guy is almost like a prisoner. So can I become the king? Yeah, you can become the king. He says, 1449, this is what happens. All right, 150 days, 150 years, July 27, 1299, July 27, 1449. It's very interesting to see what's happening. We'll come back to this in a moment. 5 months. Now, this man, this is the guy, Constantine XI, he's basically what we call a vassal of the Sultan, vassal of the Ottoman Turks. July 27, that ends that 150-year period. This is where the Byzantine Empire is. It's only going to last 4 more years now. Let's see what happens next. Trumpet number 6. Then the 6th angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the 4 horns of the golden altar, which is before God, saying to the 6th angel who had the trumpet, release the 4 angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. Let them go. So the 4 angels who had been prepared for the hour, the day, the month, and the year were released to kill 1/3 of mankind. So now they can kill, but not everybody, 1/3. There's mercy mixed with this, you see. 1/3 of mankind. Now the number of the army of horsemen was 200 million. Now this is impressionistic. It just means there's a bunch of them. They're everywhere. I heard the number of them, and I saw the horses in the vision. Those who sat on them had breastplates of fiery red, hyacinth blue, and sulphur yellow. And the heads of the horses were like the heads of lions, ferocious in other words. And out of their mouths came fire and smoke and brimstone. Whoa! By these 3 plagues, 1/3 of mankind was killed by the fire and the smoke and the brimstone which came out of their mouths. For their power is in their mouth and in their tails. For their tails are like serpents, having heads, and with them they do harm. But the rest of mankind who were not killed by these plagues did not repent of the works of their hands, that they should not worship demons and idols of gold, silver, brass, stone, and wood, which can neither see nor hear nor work. And they did not repent of their murders or their sorceries or their sexual immorality or their thefts. What a tragedy. Even after all this great catastrophe, those who were holding on to that, they didn't repent. Okay, so what are we doing with this? What's this all about? Well, these are further judgments on the persecuting Christians through Islam again. What do we mean further judgment? Well, things have gotten worse in persecution. Let's come, because we've come to from 1449 now. That's where we ended the last trumpet. This is the beginning of this next trumpet. This is a very interesting time in Christianity. You see, this is the time we're coming to when there was persecution that increased during this next phase. For example, here, the bells in Paris rang with joy when the French king allowed, with the church, killed 20,000 people in one night, I think it was, in Paris. We call them the Huguenots, a bloodbath of godly priests and bishops and people in the church who just simply wanted to read the Bible. They destroyed them. And that went on in France. France was drained of its most noble citizens. They killed, and many of them escaped to Switzerland. It had a brain drain in France because of the persecution that went on for 200 years in that country. It was vicious. We also saw that bishops were burnt at the stake in Oxford there. Remember the tremendous persecuting power of the church. It increased when the Reformation came on in a big way throughout Europe. I love those words as they're dying, those 2 guys. Did we read these? Well, let's read them again because they're inspiring. Latimer to Ridley, be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a fire, a candle by God's grace in England, as shall never be put out. That's good, isn't it? Our death, man, by us dying, many people are going to see and say, what drives these people? Jesus. We're going to light a candle by our own death, he was saying. Bishops put to death by the church. Then the 6th angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the 4 horns of the golden altar, which is before God, saying to the 6th angel who had the trumpet, release the 4 angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. 2 things here. Notice, don't miss it. The 6th angel sounded, and a voice came from the 4 horns of what? the golden altar. Yeah, it's going to be pretty bad, but there's mercy still. All the way through the first 6 trumpets, there's mercy tempered with judgment on the enemies of God's people. Release the 4 angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. Euphrates was river, that means basically Mesopotamia. This was the heartland of the Ottoman Turks. They had come from Russia and moved through, eventually coming right across to Istanbul, but this is their heartland. So God's saying, okay, let these forces loose. So the 4 angels who had been prepared for the hour, the day, the month and the year were released to kill 1/3 of mankind. Now the number of the army of the horsemen was 200 million. I heard the number of them. Wow. When you read the history of the Ottoman Turks, they just moved like lightning. They just moved right across into Bulgaria and all those parts and even into Europe. They actually carried guns from about 1400 onwards. They were magnificent men on their horses. Sometimes they'd go charging into an army that's coming for them, and then they'd turn around as if they were running away, and the guys would turn around and sit on the back of their horses and fire at them. I mean, they were incredible the way the Turks fought. Now, the Ottoman Turks were known as the Gunpowder Empire because it's these people that were some of the first to use gunpowder and cannons and so on. It was the Turks that did this. Now, notice what? Thus I saw the horses in the vision. Those who sat on them had breastplates of fiery red, hyacinth blue, and sulphur yellow. And the heads of the horses were like the heads of lions. And out of their mouths came fire and smoke and brimstone. Now, I'm sure John didn't have a clue what gunpowder and guns were in his day, but that's what it looked like to him. These masses of armies marching across Europe. And you can see these Turkish men. All right. You can see this is a cannon. They used this sort of cannon, this massive cannon. They used that to destroy the walls of Constantinople. We'll come to that in a moment. Now, you don't carry one of those cannons. It's a very long one. So what they would do is they'd take the metal with them, various animals, carry it, and then they'd set up a place to mould their cannons on site, and they'd fire them. They weren't so accurate, but they get them right up against the wall, boom. And this vassal, July 27, 1449, remember, and then comes Sultan Mehmed at the Battle of Constantinople. This is when the church in the West, and the empire in the West, East I should say, let me get it straight. The Byzantine Empire finishes because Sultan Mehmed, he took Constantinople for the first time, and the empire in the East was finished. That was on May 29, 1453, when Constantinople fell. And after that, those churches were turned into mosques and so on. And we still have some of those buildings in Constantinople today that once were churches, now they're mosques. So here's his triumphal entry into Constantinople. The Ottomans, as they said, they spread out across Europe, and they even got right to Vienna. But they were driven back eventually from Vienna and never got any further than this part. But they were taking their religion right into the heart of Europe. Eventually they would have. Now this is interesting. You see, at this very time, the Reformation was starting to kick off. And as it's starting to kick off, Charles V, who was the emperor, he had a problem, and it was called the Reformation. And Charles V wanted to get rid of the reformers, Martin Luther and all those godly priests who brought the gospel. He wanted to get rid of a lot of them because they were teaching from the Bible, and he was a devout member of the Church of Rome, and he wanted nothing to do with this. But he needed the help of some of these guys. These are what we call the electors. These are the princes of his realm. And many of them had become Protestants by now. They had become Bible-believing people. And he needed them to fight the Turks. and he couldn't turn his attention on the Reformation because he had a problem with the Turks. So while he's fighting the Turks and trying to beat them, the Reformation continues and it grows, and that's why the Reformation continued. Had it not been for the Turks, many historians say the Reformation would have floundered. We can be thankful for the Turks. They kept the Protestant Reformation alive at the right time in history. And poor old Charles V, by the way, he ended up going to a monastery himself and become a monk because he failed, and he felt miserable because he failed to destroy the Reformation. Anyway, so the four angels who had been prepared for the hour, the day, the month, and the year. What are we going to do with this time period? This is interesting. These forces are going to swarm across, but they have a limited time period, he's saying. The hour, the day, the month, and the year. In Bible prophecy, one prophetic day, one literal year, remember? So the hour. Remember, 360 days, 24 hours in a day, so divide 360 by 24, that's going to give you 15 days. Do the math, I did it myself, so it works out right. Okay, 15 days. A day in Bible prophecy is a year, remember? So we've got 1 year. 30, there's a month, so that's 30 days to a month in the Bible, remember? So they've got 30 years, and we've got a year, that's 360 days in the Bible, remember? We saw that, so we've got 360. We add them all up because it said an hour, a day, the month, and the year. You're going to come to 391 years and 15 days. When's that going to end? Well, you add it all up. The starting date, of course, back here in July 27, that was the end of the 150, remember? So you add the 391 and 15 days, and you're going to come to August the 11th, 1840. Now, what's fascinating is you read some of the history. This comes into where we're heading on next weekend. They are studying the prophet Daniel. And one of the guys, as he's studying, he says, hey, this prophecy, something's going to happen on August 11, 1840. This guy said, this is going to be the end of the Ottoman Empire in terms of its power. So what happens on August 11, 1840? This was mentioned before from this prophecy. On that very day, the Ottoman Turks seek help from the European powers. Why? Because the Egyptians were beating them. The Islamic Egyptians were beating them. They had just smashed their fleet in Syria, outside of Syria. And so the Ottoman Turks were going down the gurgler. So they went to Europe and said, come help us. Now, if you have to go to Europe and say, come help us, who's got the upper hand? Clearly, Europe. Clearly, they're gone down. They're no longer. That's why they're called the what? They're called the sick man of Europe during this period, because they have lost their clout. So right on that very date, the Turkish Empire basically says, okay, now the Brits and the Europeans were happy to do that because they needed someone in control in the Middle East at this time to you know how politics go. Anyway, trumpet number 7. Let's come. So I hope your head's not spinning. We'll sum it up in a minute, because the most important thing is not to remember the Turks and all that sort of stuff. The most important to remember why does God have this? Trumpet number 7. Then the 7th angel sounded, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. The nations were angry, and your wrath has come. See, what's been happening is God is saying, I'm coming to help my people. All down through the ages, I've been hearing their prayers. Trumpet number 1, the Jews attacked my people. I'm going to answer their cry for help, and he did. Trumpet number 2, the Romans have been smashing them to pieces. I'm going to come to their rescue. I'm going to deal with them in my time. Trumpet number 3, what is it? Corruption in the churches. They mix paganism. God says, you'll hear what I do. You want that? Well, I have to let you have that. So error comes in. Next one, what happens? Trumpet number 4. What's going to happen now? Trumpet number 4. Well, of course, now that they're getting deeper and deeper into apostasy, God has to deal with that. So trumpet number 5, Islam comes as God's instrument to deal with it. That's what happened in the Bible, you've noticed. When Egypt is smashing God's people in Egypt, God sends plagues to deal with them, to rescue his people. When God's people are in sin and terrible sin, God allows the Babylonians and the Syrians to deal with them. He removes his protective hand. It's all the way God deals with. He removes his protective hand, and then he helps his people. And so it goes on and on. Anyway, so now it's the last trumpet. The nations were angry, your wrath has come, and the time of the dead, that they should be judged, and that you should reward your servants the prophets. I'm coming to answer your prayer. I'm coming to give you a reward, my people. You reward your servants the prophets and the saints, and those who fear your name, who respect you, small and great, and destroy those who destroy the earth. You see, the trumpets are warning judgments about this one. It's coming. This day is coming. So listen. Listen to what God is saying down through the ages. God is not asleep. God is hearing prayer. God is acting. We don't have to do it. God will do it. Listen to what he's saying, because we're coming to the final judgment. This is the return of Jesus to rescue his people. But how does he do it? He has to put down their enemies to rescue his people. Jesus is coming, not as a real horse. He's coming to rescue. He's coming to take his people to give them their final reward. But I'm so glad for this verse. Watch this verse. What does it say? But in the days of the sounding of the seventh angel, when he's about to sound the mystery of God, the gospel will be finished. What's that saying? It's saying up to this point, the gospel has been available. Trumpet number 1, trumpet number 2, trumpet number 3, because the gospel's always available till you get to trumpet number 7, meaning the door is still open. That's why only a third, because God has still got the door ajar. What a beautiful thing. But sadly, when trumpet number 7's about to blow, the gospel, the mystery. Why is it called the mystery? Because it's a mystery that God would become one of us and he would take our place on the cross. That's a mystery. A good mystery. An amazing thing, in other words. Not a secret, but an amazing thing that God would do that for you and I.